The bus pulled into Fort Bragg just after dawn, its headlights cutting through a thin Carolina fog that hung low over the tarmac like a ghost that hadn't decided to leave yet. Inside, 23 soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, most of them staring out the windows with that specific look young men get when they realize the world they knew is officially behind them. Some were cracking jokes. Some were silent. Private First Class Ethan Cole was silent. He was 20 years old, lean but not imposing, with calloused hands that seemed too worn for someone his age and eyes that had a habit of noticing things, small things, the kind most people walked right past. He'd grown up in Dillon, Montana, a town so small the hardware store doubled as the barbershop on Saturdays. His father, Raymond Cole, had run a gun shop out of their garage for as long as Ethan could remember. Raymond wasn't a loud man. He didn't lecture or boast. He simply worked, and while he worked, he talked to Ethan the way a man talks when he wants the knowledge to stick, quiet and deliberate, the way water shapes rock over years rather than hours. Raymond Cole had died of a heart attack 14 months before the bus pulled into Fort Bragg. He was 51 years old. Ethan had enlisted 3 weeks after the funeral. Nobody on that bus knew any of that. To them, Ethan was just another face, young, unremarkable, no combat patch on his shoulder, no wild story to offer. When they arrived and were sorted by a sharp-voiced staff sergeant named Bellows, Ethan was assigned to Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 82nd Airborne Division. It was one of the most respected units on post. Ethan felt the weight of that immediately. Master Sergeant Dale Hicks was the kind of man who made a room feel smaller when he walked into it. He was built like a refrigerator that had been through a war, because he had been, twice. And he had a way of looking at new soldiers that wasn't cruel but was completely without mercy. He looked at each man like he was calculating exactly how much they would cost him before they became useful. When his eyes landed on Ethan, the calculation seemed to end quickly. "Cole," Hicks said, reading from his clipboard without looking up again. "Armory detail." The words landed flat. A few of the other soldiers exchanged glances. Armory detail wasn't combat training, wasn't field exercises, wasn't the kind of assignment that built a reputation. It was cleaning weapons, maintenance, the kind of work handed to soldiers that the unit hadn't figured out what to do with yet. Ethan didn't flinch. He simply said, "Yes, Sergeant," picked up his bag and followed the directions to the armory like a man who had somewhere to be. The armory at Fort Bragg's Bravo Company building was a long, narrow room that smelled of hop solvent, gun oil, and the particular metallic cold that only weapon storage can produce. Racks of M4 carbines lined the walls. Pistols sat in their cases. A worktable ran the length of one side, scarred from years of use, scattered with brushes, patches, cleaning rods, and small containers of lubricant. A single overhead fluorescent light buzzed faintly, one end slightly dimmer than the other. For most soldiers, this room would feel like a punishment. For Ethan Cole, it felt like his father's garage. He set his bag down, pulled on a pair of latex gloves, and picked up the first rifle on the rack. He ran his hands over it the way his father had taught him, not just wiping, but reading. Every scratch told a story. Every joint and pin and spring had a language, and Raymond Cole had spent years teaching his son how to listen to it. Ethan tilted the rifle toward the light, peered into the barrel, checked the bolt carrier group, and began to work. He didn't know yet that this room would change his life. He didn't know that somewhere 3 buildings away, a lieutenant colonel named Marcus Webb was sitting at a desk, reviewing unit readiness reports and pausing on a line that noted a higher-than-average weapons maintenance flag rate. He didn't know that in 6 weeks, that man would walk through this armory door and stop cold at what he found. He didn't know any of that. He just worked quietly, carefully, thoroughly, the way his father had taught him. The fluorescent light buzzed above him. Outside, the Carolina morning was warming up, and the sounds of soldiers training drifted through the walls. Inside the armory, Ethan Cole stripped a rifle down to its bones and began, piece by piece, to put it back together perfectly. Some stories begin with a battle. Some begin with a hero charging a hill. This one began with a young man, alone in a room, cleaning a gun that no one else thought mattered. By the end of his second week, they were calling him the Armory Boy. It wasn't said with cruelty exactly, at least not always. Sometimes it was just shorthand. Where's Cole? Probably in the armory. Right, the Armory Boy. But sometimes it had an edge to it, the kind that soldiers develop when someone among them isn't keeping pace with what they consider real work. The other soldiers in Bravo Company were running drills, navigating live-fire exercises, getting mud on their boots and calluses on their trigger fingers. Ethan was inside, under a buzzing fluorescent light, with a cleaning rod and a bottle of CLP lubricant. He heard the nickname. He never responded to it. What no one saw, what no one was paying enough attention to see, was what Ethan was actually doing inside that armory. He wasn't just cleaning weapons. Anyone could clean weapons. You pushed a patch through the barrel, wiped down the exterior, ran a brush through the bolt carrier group, applied lubricant, and called it done. That took 20 minutes per rifle and a basic level of attention. That was what the armory log expected. That was what the job description required. Ethan was doing something else entirely. He was diagnosing. It started on day 3 with an M4 that looked perfectly clean on the surface. He'd already run the standard checks when something made him pause, a slight resistance in the bolt carrier group that wasn't quite right. Too subtle to fail an inspection. Too easy to ignore in a busy armory on a deadline. He pulled the bolt out completely, held it under the light, and rotated it slowly. There, a hairline stress fracture along the cam pin hole, invisible unless you knew precisely where to look and precisely how to look. His father had shown him cracks like that on hunting rifles back in Montana. That weapon will fail, Raymond had told him. Not today, maybe not next week, but it will fail. And when it does, you'll wish you hadn't ignored it. Ethan tagged the rifle, wrote a detailed note in the maintenance log, and set it aside for proper inspection. Then he moved to the next one. Over the following days, a quiet pattern emerged that nobody noticed because nobody was watching closely enough. Ethan began finding things that routine inspections had missed for months. A firing pin on a Beretta M9 that had developed a microfracture from repeated dry firing. 2 M4 buffer springs that had lost enough tension to affect cycling reliability. A pistol whose extractor was worn just enough to cause intermittent ejection failures under sustained fire. None of these weapons were what the Army would officially classify as non-mission capable. All of them were what Ethan's father would have called quietly dangerous, weapons that would perform fine in training, but had a real chance of failing at the worst possible moment. He fixed what he could. What he couldn't fix himself, he logged with notes so precise and detailed that a senior armorer would later describe reading them as like getting instructions from someone who'd been doing this for 30 years. He asked for nothing in return. He told no one what he was doing. He simply worked. The days developed a rhythm. Reveille at 5:30, formation, then to the armory by 7. He ate lunch alone most days, sitting at the work table with a sandwich from the DFAC and a stripped-down pistol in front of him. He didn't mind the solitude. In some ways, it reminded him of the long Saturday afternoons in his father's garage, the radio playing low, the smell of gun oil hanging in the air, his father's hands moving over a weapon with the patience of someone who understood that rushing the small things was how the big things went wrong. He thought about his father often in that armory. The grief hadn't gone away. He'd learned by now that grief doesn't go away. It just changes shape over time. But in the armory, surrounded by the tools of a trade Raymond Cole had loved, it softened into something more like presence. Like his father was somewhere nearby, watching, nodding slowly at the work. On a Thursday in his 4th week, something happened that nearly cracked Ethan's composure. Specialist Travis Munoz, one of the louder personalities in Bravo Company, not mean-spirited but thoughtless in the way that some young men are, walked into the armory looking for a cleaning kit and found Ethan at the table with 4 rifles disassembled simultaneously. their components laid out in perfect, methodical rows. Munoz stopped and stared. "What are you doing?" "Maintenance," Ethan said without looking up. Munoz looked at the components spread across the table. "That looks like a lot." "It is," Ethan agreed. There was a pause. Munoz grabbed his cleaning kit from the shelf. At the door he stopped and looked back. "Hey, Cole, why do you actually care this much? It's just gun cleaning, man." Ethan considered the question for a moment. He set down the bolt carrier group he was holding, looked at Munoz and said, "Because someone's going to trust their life to this weapon. Seems like it should work." Munoz didn't have an answer for that. He left. Ethan went back to work. 3 buildings away, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb was preparing to conduct a surprise armory inspection. He hadn't announced it. He hadn't told Hicks. He simply decided on a Tuesday that he wanted to see the weapons himself. He had no idea what he was about to find. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb had been in the United States Army for 22 years. He'd done 2 deployments to Afghanistan and 1 to Iraq. He'd held commands at every level from platoon to battalion. He'd buried 3 men he'd led and carried the weight of each one with the particular silence that combat leaders develop when the alternative, letting the grief show, feels like a betrayal of the mission. He was not a sentimental man. He was not prone to surprise. After 22 years, he had seen nearly everything the Army could show a person. He was not prepared for what he found in the Bravo Company Armory on a Tuesday morning in October. He arrived unannounced at 800, the kind of entrance that was designed to catch a unit in its actual operating state rather than its performance state. Staff Sergeant Bellows, who spotted him first, went noticeably pale and reached for his radio before Webb waved him off. "Stand easy. I'm just looking." He walked into the armory the way he walked into every room, observing before speaking, processing before reacting. It was a discipline he developed early in his career after a senior officer told him, "Webb, the most dangerous words in leadership are 'I've already seen enough.'" He never forgot it. The armory was clean. Not regulation clean, genuinely clean. The kind of clean that came from someone caring about the space, not just meeting a standard. The weapons on the racks sat correctly. The work table was organized with a precision that struck Webb as unusual, not obsessive, but intentional, as if the person who arranged it understood the value of order as a functional tool rather than an aesthetic preference. Then Webb began checking the weapons. He pulled the first M4 off the rack the way he'd pulled thousands of weapons over his career, practiced, automatic expert. He checked the barrel, the bolt carrier group, the trigger group. What he found made him pause. The weapon wasn't just clean. It was functioning at a level that exceeded what normal maintenance cycles produced. He put it back and pulled another. Same result. Then another. He spent 40 minutes going through the armory, checking weapons at random, cross-referencing with the maintenance log. What he found in that log made him sit down on the edge of the work table and read from the beginning. Page after page of entries, detailed, precise, written in a hand that was careful but not showy, described adjustments, repairs, and corrections that no one had ordered. Stress fractures caught, springs replaced before failure, worn components flagged and addressed. Every entry was signed the same way. PFCE Cole. Webb had been on post for 2 years. He'd reviewed hundreds of personnel files. He searched his memory and came up blank on Ethan Cole. He went back to his office, pulled the file, and read it in 10 minutes. Basic training, solid scores, no distinctions. Pre-enlistment background, rural Montana, father deceased, no prior military service. No special weapons training listed. No formal armorer certification. No combat experience. Webb read it twice. Then he put the file down, stood up, and walked back to the armory. Ethan was at the work table when Webb walked in. A disassembled M9 laid out before him in a pattern that Webb recognized. Not standard field strip, but detail strip. The kind of complete disassembly that exposed every component. Ethan looked up, registered the rank on Webb's collar, and immediately began to stand. Stay seated, Webb said, not harshly, just cleanly. He pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down across the worktable from Ethan Cole. For a moment, he said nothing. He watched. Ethan, after a beat of uncertain stillness, went back to work, his hands moving over the components of the M9 with a steadiness that didn't perform for the audience of one watching him. Webb watched him reassemble the pistol. He watched the way Ethan's hands moved, not fast, not showy, but deeply sure. The kind of sureness that comes from years of repetition and genuine understanding, not rehearsal. When Ethan finished and placed the reassembled pistol on the table, Webb reached out and picked it up. He worked the slide, checked the function, looked down the sights. Perfect. He set it down. "How long have you been doing this?" Webb asked. "Since I got here, sir," Ethan said. "Before that," Webb said, "how long before the Army?" There was a pause. Something moved across Ethan's face, not pain exactly, but the shadow of it. "Since I was about 8 years old, sir," he said. "My father was a gunsmith." Webb nodded slowly. He looked around the armory at the racks of weapons, the spotless work table, the maintenance log sitting open nearby. "Does anyone know you've been doing this?" he asked. "The repairs, the flagging." "It's in the log, sir," Ethan said. "I know it's in the log," Webb said. "I mean, does anyone know?" Ethan looked at him steadily. "I don't think anyone's been reading the log, sir." Webb held the young soldier's gaze for a long moment. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and picked up his cover from the table. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said quietly. "Don't change anything." He walked out. The door closed behind him. Ethan sat for a moment in the silence of the armory, unsure what had just happened, then reached for the next weapon in the rack. In his office 4 minutes later, Marcus Webb sat down at his desk, opened a new document on his computer, and began to type. His senior officers would later say they'd never seen him look quite like he did that afternoon, like a man who had just found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Colonel Webb told no one what he was doing. That was deliberate. In 22 years of military leadership, Webb had learned that the moment you announce something as significant, the environment around it changes, people perform, they adjust, they become aware of being watched. He wanted no performance. He wanted truth. So he kept what he'd seen in the armory to himself, spoke to no one about Ethan Cole, and spent 2 days thinking carefully about what to do next. On the 3rd day, he acted. He went to the unit's weapons cage after hours and selected 2 rifles from the inventory, both M4 carbines, both externally identical, both appearing clean and functional to any standard inspection. The first rifle was in perfect working order. The second, Webb had prepared himself, with help from the post's senior armorer, Chief Warrant Officer Sandra Price, who was one of the most experienced weapons technicians on Fort Bragg. Together, they introduced a single, deliberate flaw into the second weapon, a stress fracture in the firing pin, hairline thin, located in a position that made it virtually invisible without detailed strip inspection and precise knowledge of where to look. Price had pressed Webb 3 times on whether he was sure about the test. "That flaw wouldn't show up in a standard inspection," she said. "I know," Webb said. "It wouldn't show up in most advanced inspections," she said. "I know," Webb said again. Price studied him for a moment. "Who are you testing?" "Someone I'm not sure about yet," Webb said, which wasn't entirely true. He was already fairly sure. But certainty in leadership required evidence, not instinct. He placed both rifles in the armory that evening after Ethan had left for the day, sliding them into the rack without a note, without instruction, without any indication that they were different from anything else in the room. Then he went home, slept 5 hours, and was back at his desk by 5:30. At 7:45, Ethan Cole arrived at the armory and began his morning work. At 9:30, Webb's desk phone rang. It was Corporal Hughes from the front desk. "Sir, PFC Cole left something at the duty desk for you, said it was urgent." Webb walked to the duty desk himself rather than sending someone. On the counter sat two M4 carbines, each with a small tag attached to the trigger guard. The first tag on the weapon in perfect condition read, "Inspected. No defects found. Mission capable. 4 words. Clean. Accurate." The second tag, the one attached to the weapon with the hidden firing pin fracture, had a longer note, written in Ethan's careful hand on a piece of torn notepad paper. Webb read it standing at the duty desk, and he read it twice. Firing pin, stress fracture located at base shaft, approximately formed from the crown, not visible under standard inspection. Weapon would likely function through initial engagement, but risks failure at sustained fire, estimated failure point between 40–80 rounds depending on conditions. Fracture pattern consistent with metal fatigue rather than impact damage, possibly manufacturing variance or high round count. Recommend replacement before any operational use. PFC E. Cole. Webb folded the note. He held it in his hand for a moment. Then he walked directly to Chief Warrant Officer Price's office, knocked once, and put the note on her desk without a word. Price read it. Her expression, which was not the kind that shifted easily, shifted. "That's exactly right," she said quietly. "Word for word, that's the correct diagnosis. How did he?" "He didn't know it was a test," Webb said. Price looked up. "He just found it." "He just found it," Webb confirmed. That afternoon, Webb called a closed meeting with the two senior officers in his immediate circle, Major Carla Thompson, his executive officer, and Command Sergeant Major Darius Elliott, the highest-ranking non-commissioned officer in the battalion. He laid out what he'd seen over the past 2 weeks without embellishment. He showed them the maintenance logs. He showed them the note. He let them read it themselves and waited. Thompson looked up first. "He's not a trained armorer." "No," Webb said. "He doesn't have a weapons MOS," Elliott said. MOS, Military Occupational Specialty, was the Army's classification system for what soldiers were trained to do. Ethan's MOS was standard infantry. Nothing about it suggested what he was actually capable of. "No," Webb said again. Elliott turned the note over in his hand slowly, the way a man does when he's processing something that doesn't fit his existing framework. He was a 26-year Army veteran who had seen exceptional soldiers and had a highly calibrated sense of what exceptional actually looked like versus what it merely appeared to be. He read the note a third time. "This kid," Elliott said finally, "caught something that Sandra Price and I put in specifically to be uncatchable." "Yes," Webb said. The room was quiet for a moment. "So what do we do with him?" Thompson asked. Webb leaned back in his chair and looked at the note in Elliott's hand. Outside his office window, he could see the parade ground where soldiers were running drills, could hear the distant cadence of a sergeant calling a formation. The ordinary business of an Army installation moving through its ordinary day. "We figure out exactly what we have," Webb said, "and then we make sure we don't waste it." Webb didn't call Ethan in immediately. He waited 3 more days. Those days were purposeful. He reviewed Ethan's full records from MEPS, the Military Entrance Processing Station, where recruits were assessed before enlistment. He pulled his ASVAB scores, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, a test that measured a range of skills from mechanical comprehension to spatial reasoning. Ethan's mechanical comprehension score was 98 out of 99. His score in auto and shop information, which covered tools, mechanical systems, and technical problem-solving, was a perfect 99. Numbers that should have triggered an automatic flag toward a technical MOS. Numbers that somehow, in the machinery of Army processing, had ended up pointing a kid with a near-perfect mechanical aptitude score toward general infantry, and from there to cleaning guns in an armory no one checked. Webb stared at those scores for a long time. When he finally called Ethan in on a Friday morning with a gray sky sitting low over Fort Bragg, he had the file open on his desk. Ethan knocked once, entered, stood at attention. Webb told him to sit. He asked his questions without preamble. He'd found over the years that directness produced more honest answers than working up to a point. "Where did you learn what you know about weapons?" Webb asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. "My father, sir." "Tell me about him." Something happened in Ethan's face. Not a breaking down, nothing as dramatic as that, but a slight softening around the eyes, a shift in the set of his jaw. He sat up straighter, as if the memory of Raymond Cole required a certain posture to speak about properly. He told Webb about the garage in Dillon, about the long afternoons disassembling hunting rifles, competition pistols, service weapons that local law enforcement brought in for repair, about his father's philosophy that a weapon was a tool, and a tool deserved to be understood completely, not just operated, about the way Raymond Cole had taught him to listen to metal, to feel the difference between a spring that had life in it and one that was one compression away from failure, about how he'd been doing full detail strips on complex firearm systems since he was 12 years old. He told Webb about the heart attack simply, without dramatization, in the way that people speak about things they've had to say out loud enough times that they've learned to say them without collapsing. 51 years old. A Tuesday morning. The shop door unlocked, customers waiting, Raymond Cole gone. Webb listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the office was quiet. Through the window, a formation was moving across the parade ground in the distance. "Why didn't you tell anyone what you were doing in the armory?" Webb asked. "The repairs, the documentation." Ethan considered the question genuinely, as if he hadn't entirely worked it out himself. "It needed to be done, sir," he said finally, "and I could do it. That seemed like enough reason." Webb nodded slowly. He closed the file on his desk and looked at Ethan directly. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. "I want you to keep doing what you're doing. Don't change anything. Don't talk about this to anyone in the unit." Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." "One more thing," Webb said. He leaned forward slightly. "That weapon I left in the armory, the one with the firing pin fracture, how long did it take you to find it?" Ethan's expression didn't change. "About 11 minutes, sir." Webb held his gaze for a moment, then he dismissed him. That evening, Webb composed a message to two people. The first was a contact at the Army Ordnance Corps, the branch responsible for weapons, ammunition, and equipment maintenance across the Army. The second was a contact at Special Operations Command, a man named Colonel Bernard Ockafer, whom Webb had known since they were captains together in Afghanistan. The message to each was brief and identically worded, with Ethan's file attached. "This soldier sees what trained eyes cannot. Recommend you take a look." He sent both messages and shut his computer off. He drove home. He ate dinner with his wife. He slept better than he had in weeks, not because anything had been resolved yet, but because he had done what a commander is supposed to do. He had seen something real and refused to let the institution's inertia bury it. In the armory, at that same hour, Ethan Cole was working late. He'd found something in a batch of weapons returned from a training exercise that he wanted to get through before the weekend. He didn't know about the messages. He didn't know about the 2 phone calls Webb had made that afternoon. He didn't know that his name was traveling up the chain of command toward people and places he'd never imagined. He knew the weapons. He knew the work. He had a lamp, a set of brushes, and a table full of things that needed his attention. That was enough. That had always been enough. Captain Diana Reyes didn't believe in hype. She'd been around long enough to know that the Army generated hype the way engines generated heat, constantly, automatically, as a byproduct of motion rather than a product of intention. Soldiers got talked up. Careers got inflated. Reputations were built on stories that improved with each retelling, until the actual human being at the center of the story bore only a passing resemblance to the legend that preceded them. She'd been burned by hype before, a young operator candidate whose range scores were mythological, and whose judgment under pressure turned out to be thin as paper. She didn't make that mistake twice. So when Colonel Webb's message arrived recommending she meet with a PFC who cleaned guns in a Bravo Company armory, her first instinct was skepticism. Her second instinct was also skepticism. But she respected Webb. He was not a man who trafficked in exaggeration, and his message had been unusually sparse on adjectives, which, paradoxically, made it more compelling. Webb's message about a soldier he was unimpressed by would have been longer. This message was short. That told her something. She arranged the assessment herself rather than delegating it, booking a session in the Fort Bragg Weapons Evaluation Lab on a Wednesday morning, a controlled environment with proper lighting, tool access, and documentation capability. She told Webb she'd run the session, review the findings, and give him an honest report. He thanked her. She appreciated that he didn't try to pre-sell her on the outcome. Ethan arrived at the lab at 800 in a clean uniform that managed to look slightly out of place on him, not slovenly, just more comfortable in work clothes than dress ones. He was younger than Reyes had pictured. She showed him the room, the tools, the table, and then set a weapon in front of him. A malfunctioning HK-416, a rifle used extensively by Special Operations units, which had been brought in from a training rotation with a reported issue that the unit's own weapons sergeant had been unable to resolve. The symptom was intermittent failure to feed. The weapon occasionally failed to chamber the next round properly, a malfunction that, in a combat scenario, could mean the difference between engagement and silence at the worst possible moment. Reyes had reviewed the weapons sergeant's notes. He was a capable, experienced man with over a decade of weapons maintenance behind him. He'd checked the magazine, the feed ramp, the bolt carrier, the extractor. He'd found nothing definitive. She handed the rifle to Ethan and said, "Tell me what's wrong with it." She expected him to begin talking, to narrate the process, to perform his expertise the way that people who want to impress perform expertise, with commentary and vocabulary designed to signal depth of knowledge. Instead, Ethan went quiet. He sat down at the table and began to work, and the quiet he brought with him was complete and total, the quiet of a person who disappears into a task the way some people disappear into books, the outside world ceasing to exist in any meaningful way. Reyes watched. She checked her watch at irregular intervals, not impatiently but methodically, documenting the timeline. At the 12-minute mark, Ethan set the rifle down and looked up. "The issue is the gas key," he said. "The staking, the small metal crimps that lock the gas key screws in place, has worked partially loose on one side, not visible without a specific check because the screw itself is still seated, but the gas key is moving fractionally under cycling pressure. At slow fire it cycles fine. Under rapid fire or stress conditions, the gas pressure differential causes the feeding instability. It'll get worse over time, not better." He paused. "Also, and this might not be related to the main issue, the extractor spring feels like it's at about 60% tension. Not failing yet, but worth replacing while you have the weapon open." Reyes stared at him. She picked up the rifle, ran her own check on the gas key, and felt it, just barely, the faintest micro-movement that she would not have identified as the source of a feeding problem without being told to look for it. It was there. He was right. She'd been a Special Forces weapons advisor for 6 years, and she had not caught it in the pre-session review. She set the rifle down. "How long have you been working on HK-416s?" she asked. "I haven't," Ethan said. "This is the first one I've worked on, but the gas system principle is similar too." "I know the principle," Reyes said. Not dismissively, she just needed a moment to recalibrate. She spent the next 3 hours with Ethan in that lab. She put 4 more weapons in front of him, different platforms, different presented issues, different complexity levels. He worked through each one with the same focused silence, the same methodical thoroughness, the same uncanny accuracy. On one weapon, a Sig Sauer that had been flagged as potentially unserviceable, He found a defect that Reyes had intentionally introduced in the pre-dawn hours that morning as an objective test. He found it in 9 minutes. She drove back to her office in silence. That evening, she opened a blank report template and began to type. She was not a writer who reached for color or decoration. Her reports were spare, factual, precisely worded. The word exceptional appeared 4 times before she stopped counting. The final line of the report read, "Recommend immediate reassignment to specialized ordnance assessment track. Leaving this asset in a standard infantry role represents a material risk to unit readiness. This is not a developmental recommendation. This is an operational one." She submitted the report at 21:14 hours, then sat back in her chair in her empty office and thought about a young man in a lab who'd looked at an unfamiliar weapon system for the first time and seen what nobody else had been able to see. She thought about Raymond Cole's garage in Montana. She'd read the background notes. Some things, she decided, couldn't be taught. They could only be inherited. The call came at 200 on a Thursday morning in February. Ethan was 4 weeks into his new assignment under the Weapons and Tactical Assessment Program, still learning the contours of his changed role, still adjusting to the reality that the Army now knew his name for reasons other than his assignment to armory detail. He'd moved into better quarters, received access to a properly equipped weapons lab, and begun working with a small team of ordnance specialists on evaluation projects that were several levels above what he'd been doing in the Bravo Company armory. He was the youngest person on the team by a decade. He didn't talk much. The others had learned quickly that this was not a limitation. The call was from Captain Reyes. "Get dressed," she said. "Bring nothing that isn't mission essential. I'll explain in the vehicle." He was dressed in 4 minutes. Reyes was outside in 6. She drove without turning the radio on, and in the darkness of the vehicle she told him what was happening. A specialized reconnaissance unit, call sign Blackthorn, was 7 hours from launch on a mission in Eastern Europe. The operation was sensitive enough that she couldn't give him the full picture, and he didn't need it. What he needed to understand was this: the unit's precision long-range rifles, a set of 6 Mk-21 precision sniper rifles configured for suppressed operation in cold weather conditions, had begun exhibiting serious malfunction patterns during the final equipment check. Under the simulated cold weather conditions of the pre-mission rehearsal, 2 of the 6 rifles had experienced significant failure to feed and failure to extract malfunctions. A third was showing inconsistent bolt travel. The unit's own weapons sergeants, experienced, skilled, the best in the business, had been working on the problem for 4 hours and had not identified the root cause. The mission could not launch without functioning weapons. The mission also could not be delayed beyond the launch window without compromising the operational timeline in ways that could not be recovered. Webb had made a call to Reyes. Reyes had made a call to Ethan. "You might not be able to fix it," Reyes told him, not unkindly, "but right now you're the best option we have." "I understand," Ethan said. They drove through the February dark to a building Ethan hadn't been to before, nondescript, unmarked, lit from inside with the flat, purposeful light of a space that didn't care about aesthetics. Inside, he met the Blackthorn team for the first time. They were not the kind of men who looked like soldiers in the Hollywood sense. They were quiet, compact, observant, the specific type of human being that long-term special operations service produces, dangerous without performing danger. They looked at Ethan with the professional neutrality of men who had learned not to waste energy on skepticism when time was short. If Webb and Reyes had vouched for this kid, they'd give him the room to work. The rifles were laid out on a long table, each with a separate kit of components and a weapons sergeant's notes. The room was cold. The building's HVAC had been brought down to approximate the operating environment's temperature. Ethan's breath fogged faintly as he sat down. He picked up the first affected rifle and began. For 40 minutes the room was nearly silent. The Blackthorn weapons sergeants watched. Ray's watched from a corner, arms crossed, quiet. Someone brought coffee that nobody drank. Outside, the February night pressed against the building, indifferent and cold. Ethan moved through the rifles one by one, and what he was building in his mind was a pattern, not just individual weapon failures, but a systemic picture that connected the three affected rifles and distinguished them from the three functional ones. The difference, he found, was subtle and devastating in its simplicity. The cold weather lubrication used on the affected rifles was a newer formulation, recently issued, intended to perform better in sub-zero conditions, and performing excellently in most contexts. But under a specific combination of temperature and operating pressure, it was developing a viscosity characteristic that was creating microresistance in the bolt carrier travel path. Not enough to cause problems at range temperature. Just enough at mission temperature to push the rifles into the failure zone. "It's the CLP," he said, not dramatically, just clearly. "The new cold weather formulation. At operational temperature, it's thickening slightly under bolt pressure. The affected rifles have tighter tolerance bolt carrier groups than the unaffected ones, manufacturing variants, not a defect, but the tolerances interact with the viscosity issue at low temperature." He looked up at the room. "If we flush the affected rifles and relubricate with the standard formulation, not the new one, and then re-zero under temperature conditions, they'll run." There was a pause. One of the weapons sergeants, a master sergeant with a gray-streaked beard and the specific stillness of someone who'd spent years in close proximity to violence, looked at Ethan for a moment, then looked at the rifles. "That's it," he said, not dismissively, genuinely. "That's it," Ethan said. They worked through the night. Ethan directed the flush and relube process, guided the re-zero checks, verified function on each rifle in sequence. At 5:17, all 6 Mk-21s were fully operational. At 6:30, the Blackthorn team conducted a final function check and confirmed. At 800, the mission launched. Ethan sat in the corner of the now empty room as they left, coat still on, watching the last of the operators file out through the door. The master sergeant with the gray beard was the last to go. At the door, he stopped. He didn't turn around. He said, "Good work, Cole," and walked out. Rays drove Ethan back in the early morning light. Neither of them spoke for the first 20 minutes. Then Rays said, "The mission's going to succeed or fail for 100 reasons we can't control, but the weapons won't be one of them. Because of you." Ethan looked out the window at the February landscape, pale and flat in the morning light. "My dad used to say," he said quietly, "that the best work is the work nobody notices, because when everything goes right, you're invisible. The weapon fires. The mission runs. Nobody thinks about the person who made sure it would." Rays nodded slowly and kept driving. The mission succeeded. No weapons malfunctions were reported. 3 weeks after the Blackthorn mission, Bravo Company stood in formal assembly on the Fort Bragg parade ground. It was a cold morning, the kind where breath came in small clouds and boots rang sharply against frozen ground. The sky was a hard, pale blue. Flags snapped in a wind that came from the north, steady and indifferent, the way February wind in North Carolina tends to be. Soldiers stood in crisp lines, uniforms pressed, faces forward, doing what soldiers do at formal assemblies, enduring the cold with professional dignity and privately wondering how long it was going to take. Master Sergeant Hicks stood at the left end of the formation, his face an unreadable wall, same as always. Specialist Munoz was somewhere in the middle, standing straight, blowing warmth into his cupped hands between commands. Captain Rays stood to one side, not in the formation but present, watching. Chief Warrant Officer Sandra Price had driven over from the Ordnance Building. Colonel Bernard Acaffer from SOCOM was there, which was unusual enough that the more senior NCOs in the formation had noticed and quietly passed the word. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb stood at the front. He didn't use notes. Webb had never used notes for a speech in his career, not because he thought it looked better. He genuinely did not care how it looked, but because he believed that words worth saying should be words a person actually remembered, not words a person read off a page. He spoke for 12 minutes. He didn't open with military history or with the language of official ceremony. He opened with a question, the kind of question that made the formation unconsciously lean forward. "How many of you," he said, "have ever had a weapon fail at the worst possible moment?" Hands didn't go up. That wasn't the invitation, but the formation's energy shifted in a way Webb could feel. The way a room shifts when a speaker says something that lands in the actual experience of the people listening. He let the question sit for a beat. Then he told the story. He told it completely and without embellishment, starting from the October morning he'd walked into the armory unannounced and found weapons maintained at a standard that exceeded anything routine inspection cycles had produced. He described what he'd found in the maintenance logs, the repairs, the flags, the detailed documentation of problems that should have been caught and hadn't been. He described the test, laying out both rifles without instruction, and read Ethan's note aloud, word for word, including the precise technical diagnosis, and let the silence that followed the reading speak for itself. He told them about the Blackthorn mission, without disclosing operational details, speaking only to the fact that 6 precision rifles had been on the edge of failure before a critical operation, and that a young specialist from Bravo Company had worked through a February night to diagnose a systemic fault that experienced weapons sergeants had not been able to identify, and had restored all 6 weapons to full operational capability in time for a successful mission launch. He paused. "I want to be very clear about something," Webb said. His voice was steady, the way voices get when a person has thought carefully about exactly what they want to say and has decided to say it without armor. "What PFC Cole did is not less than battlefield courage. It is a different form of the same thing. The courage to show up every day to work that nobody sees and nobody thanks you for. The courage to care about something enough to do it exactly right when doing it approximately right would have been acceptable and would have gone unnoticed. The courage to be excellent in private." He let that land. "This army runs on people like him," Webb said. "It always has. We don't always see them clearly enough." He called Ethan forward. Ethan walked out of the formation and across the parade ground in the cold morning air, boots ringing against the frozen ground, and the sound of his footsteps in the silence felt larger than it should have, the way small sounds do when everyone is paying attention. He stopped in front of Webb and stood at attention. Webb formally promoted him, the words read in the official cadence of Army ceremony, the new rank affixed to his collar by Webb's own hand. Then he stepped back and said, quietly enough that only Ethan and the nearest officers could hear it, "Your father raised someone worth knowing, son." Ethan's jaw tightened briefly. He swallowed once. "Thank you, sir," he said. After the ceremony, as the formation was dismissed and soldiers moved in the loose, relieved way that formations always move when they're released, Ethan was making his way back when he felt a presence stop beside him. He turned. Master Sergeant Dale Hicks, who had looked at him on the first day and made a calculation that had ended quickly, who had sent him to the armory like a man shelving something he didn't know what to do with, stood there in the cold morning light. Hicks didn't speak. He wasn't a man who built speeches. He looked at Ethan for a long, honest moment and then gave him a single slow nod, the kind of nod that in the language of men like Dale Hicks meant more than a paragraph. Ethan nodded back. He accepted the path into the Army's Specialized Ordnance and Tactical Systems program that week, signing the paperwork in Ray's office on a Thursday afternoon, with the kind of quiet that surrounded him whenever he was doing something he knew mattered. He would go on to find things, flaws, patterns, failures in waiting, that would protect lives in operations he would never be able to talk about publicly, in theaters of conflict whose names would never appear in the news. his work would remain largely invisible, because the best work always is. Raymond Cole had taught him that. In the armory at Fort Bragg, on the night before he transferred out, Ethan stopped in one last time. He stood at the work table in the familiar smell of gun oil and solvent, under the buzzing fluorescent light with its one dim end. He ran his hand along the scarred wood of the table. He stood there for a long time, not sad, not triumphant, just present, the way his father had always taught him to be with the work, fully there, fully paying attention. Then he turned off the light, walked out, and closed the door behind him.